guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna make a project that you guys actually voted for over on my community tab. I asked you guys what video you would like to see next, and you guys voted for a DIY prom dress. Really cool, and very coincidentally, there's actually a small story to this video idea, because a few weeks ago a viewer contacted me over Instagram asking for advice for a prom dress that she would love to make herself. This is actually the prom dress that she fell in love with, and quite frankly, I can see why. It looks stunning on her. The fit of the dress, the pattern itself, the style, the fabric, the train, oh my god, the train, everything looks amazing on her. I was amazed by the fact that she went out of her way to describe her situation and asked me to do a pattern for her. So thank you so much to put so much trust in me and my skills that you would sew a prom dress after a pattern I made. So thank you so much. So this is exactly what we're gonna do today. We're gonna try to replicate this prom dress. So let's get started. So actually I skipped the whole pattern making process. I filmed it, but I'm not gonna include it in this video. But if you're really interested in how I made this pattern, just leave me a comment down below, and then I might consider also making a video about the pattern making itself. I also included a link in the video description down below where you can check out my pattern that I made. It's available from extra small to extra large, so I'd be really happy if you check that out. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you like what you see, give it a thumbs up, and links to my social media are down in the description as well. So with that out of the way, let's begin with the video. I started off with cutting all my pattern pieces out of this beautiful cotton duchess satin in this dusty pink color. It always hurts me so much to more or less waste so much fabric, but I of course will keep all the offcuts for later projects. In total, I end up with 8 pieces. I wanted to include some sort of stabilization for the top part of the dress, but that is completely optional. I opted for a lining that would only go to the waistline to minimize the bulk it would create. I used some leftover pink cotton fabric that I also used for my bedsheet upcycling dress. It just happened to be somewhat the same color. I cut out my pieces and gave them a good pressing with my iron. Before sewing anything, I prepared my pattern pieces with some interfacing tape. This one specifically is an elastic tape that just gives the curves of the pieces a little bit more strength and prevents the edges from fraying. I ironed this onto all armhole cutouts. I then switched between sewing one seam of my lining, pressing that seam and adding some boning to it. For the front and front side seam, I chose to put the boning on the seam allowance of the front piece rather than in the middle, because the curves of the side front piece were pretty intense, as you can see here. To help iron curvy seams like this, I like to use my sleeve board, but I am also looking into getting a more curved version of this. I am using stitchable boning as always, therefore I can directly stitch the boning onto my piece without having to add boning channels to it. It is important to cut the boning without overlapping your seam allowance, as it would prevent turning your piece over nicely later on. I like to stitch my boning twice, once up and once down the piece, to have the look of a nice and even boning channel on the outside. I continue to do that with all my other seams. Since the dress has a low open back, I didn't put any boning on the seam between the side back and the back piece, as it just is too short. Instead, I backstitched the seam. Optionally, you can add some padding. I just had some of these bra inserts laying around, so I figured I might as well use them. I pinned them to the respective spots on the lining and stitched them down in a way that somewhat resembles the lines bras or corsets would have, but in the end I completely freestyled them. So I basically stitched the padding down on the lower corners and then added some decorative seams in the middle to just hold everything in place. But after that, the padding had these bulges that I didn't like and that I was sure of would show through the satin layer of the dress. So I just took some cotton canvas fabric that I used to make mock-ups with and added it to the top. I only cut out the front pieces as the padding doesn't go further than that. And with that done, I was just able to add it on top of the padding layer, which basically made the whole thing invisible from the outside. So perfect. Okay, with the lining done for now, it is time to start with the satin. First, I overlocked all the side seams. With that done, I tackle the hidden zipper in the back. I like to start with stuff like that before sewing anything together, as it is much easier to move around. Especially with this dress, it ends up being really heavy. So I changed the presser foot to my invisible zipper foot and sewed the zipper in. After that, I carefully align the two pieces and close the middle back seam. To be honest, the color itself, it doesn't really look that off, as I pointed out in my vlog, which is gonna come out next week. But I had much trouble finding a dusty pink invisible zipper, so I ended up going with a tan one because it was the less intrusive, I guess. But to me, it's totally fine, and I'm happy that I went with this option rather than the other two that I still had. Speaking about it, I started to vlog, so just give it a try and I hope you like it. I'm gonna include a lot of behind the scenes footage, especially from this dress, or like from the beginning where I source my fabric, with the whole getting it sent and having a timeline and stuff like that. And yeah, just take a look. It's linked in the eye right now, so give it a try. Coming back to the dress, I ironed the seam open and continue stitching all the panels of the dress together. I also switched between stitching and ironing the seam allowance open and put some seam tape to basically glue down the seam allowance. That is something really cool, and as I said, check out my blog about it. I go more into detail what this is and what it is used for. This is especially useful for round seams like this one in the side front and front piece, as it's sometimes really hard, especially with heavier fabric, to iron the seam allowance down and make it stay. So I recommend you use something like this if you have a situation that is similar to this one. To make the curved seam as neat as possible, I also cut some triangles into the seam allowance so that they lay flat next to each other. And on to all the other seams. Make sure if you do something like this, or if you actually replicate this dress, to bring plenty of time for stuff like ironing down the seam allowance and pressing the tape to it, because the dress is getting wide. It has something around 5 to 6 meters circumference in the skirt, and that takes a long time to neatly press down all the seams, to add the tape, to overlock, and so on and so on. So, just for you to know. On the other hand though, it is a pretty easy project, because you literally have to do the same thing over and over again, but it's always the same thing. Like, you sew down one seam and you press it, and then you put tape, and that's literally it. Of course, the lining piece is a little bit harder, I would say, but in the end it's also just sewing the seams together, and then that's it. So, to me at least, it feels like this is one of the easier projects. Now, coming back to the lining piece, I overlock the hem and turn it up to top stitch it down and create a nice finish. A last press of the hem. I did not realize that in the cut, but it actually looks like I was ironing my hand. I was not, but I ironed the hem, and then it is basically already time to put the elastic and therefore sew the lining to the actual piece. I cut elastics for the sleeves at around 16 to 19 centimeters. I ended up doing 16, but I do recommend you go for a little bit more, as it was quite tight around my shoulders. But I guess that comes down to body size, so always check it twice on yourself how much you need before you sew it in place. Once you reach the point where the elastic is sewn in, just back tack a few times over and over again so that you make sure the elastic is in there and does not come out. Make sure to also stitch into it, because sometimes, especially with round and like tiny elastics like this, your stitch is bigger than your elastic's circumference, so make sure to stitch into it, that it stays put. I've learned it the hard way. Once that is done, I cut away excess seam allowance in the corners to make the lining fold easier. I recommend cutting stairs, so cutting one seam allowance down to 5 mm and leaving the other to make a nice smooth transition. But I ended up cutting the seam allowances down to 5 mm completely because I made the mistake and left the padding hanging over. So I stitched over the padding there, and that just gives a lot of extra unnecessary bulge that needs to be cut off. In the curves, I cut into the seam allowance every 2 centimeters or so to give the fabric enough room to turn over nicely. And now the most satisfying part, popping the edges out and turning the whole thing over. It's also really nice because you end up seeing finally how the whole thing ends up looking, because before you always have this 1 centimeter seam allowance there, and to me this is always the most satisfying moment, and I'm always really, really happy because this is a feeling of accomplishment somehow, and it also is near at the end of the project. So this this is always the best. After having it turned over for the first time, you see what you still need to take off. Basically, I realized that I had the padding in the seam allowance that obviously needs to be taken off, and I did so by cutting it at an angle so that it would smoothly turn over and fold nicely. And when that was done, I was pretty happy with how it fell, and I just needed to basically iron the whole thing. To prevent the lining coming out, I fixed the hem to some of the seam allowances by just making a pretty loose stitch. I'm going to show you right now how I am doing that because I don't know the name of it, but you basically make a very loose stitch and then make your thread basically go around it a few times to strengthen it a bit, and that just keeps the lining put. So, if you are 165, let's say, or smaller, your dress is basically done now. You need to hem it and then you're done. But I put it on and I was too tall for the height of the dress, basically, especially if I were to wear heels with it. So I had to elongate the whole dress, and I did so by just cutting out some panels that were 13 centimeters long all around the whole dress and made a big panel with a lot of fabric. I think around 5 to 6 meters in circumference, I already said that, and just, yeah, fix the problem, I guess. So I will include this problem fixing into the whole pattern that is linked in the description box down below. But as I said, if you are smaller than me, you do not need to do this. If you are taller than me, most people are, you probably want to even elongate the dress more. So I would suggest around 20 centimeters on the bottom, and you can cut out the whole panels with those 20 centimeters or whatever you choose already included. I actually quite like the look of this added panel on the hem, so you're gonna see it later what it looks like with the panel. I really like it, but obviously you can just put the whole pattern piece onto the existing pieces and you're good to go. If you choose to do exactly what I am doing right here, you have to cut out every panel 4 times because it's going to be the facing of it basically as well, and you just stitch them together, iron them open, and put some seam tape there as well. And then after that you basically stitch the longer side of the two together and turn it over to create this panel. Make sure to name the panels that you cut out or to put the pattern piece to it, because all of the panels have different widths and it's very important that you sew them together the correct way, obviously, so they match the seams on the actual dress. Also, time is of the essence here. Again, this is gonna take quite a while because you literally make this, what you see right here, twice, and then you stitch it together, and then you still have to attach it to the dress. I would also suggest you mark your middle front or your middle back, or both, the best, just for you to know where to stitch both of the panels together, because it can be quite tricky to still know where what is, because this thing is so long. I stitched maybe a few times the wrong way and I regret not pinning it, but just for you to know better, because it wasn't cool. It was not fun. And once that is done, I iron everything with the seam on the side of the facing so that it is not visible from the outside. Also, marking the middle front here is key again, to give you one point where you attach both of them together, and from then on it's just a matter of matching all the seams together and it should be fine. But that one position in your dress is really important. To make it really neat, you would stitch the outer layer onto the dress and then blind stitch the facing to it. That way you will not see any seams at all, but to be honest, that doesn't really add anything other than work, since all the other seams are exposed anyway. So I decided to stitch everything to the hem of the dress and overlock it all together. I also added seam tape again, as the seam allowance was not really happy staying facing down. But that concludes this video and this project. I am so happy with how the dress came out. In the end, I'm going to show you some pictures in just a second. But if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment what you want to see next. And of course, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more stuff like this. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.